Okay, it's Thursday, and Ezekiel chapter 9 picks up where chapter 8 left off. Remember, Ezekiel somewhere around the fifth year since his exile, and he's dwelling in Babylonia, and he is taken in a vision. So presumably he doesn't physically move, but in this vision, in this prophecy, in this dream, he's transported to Jerusalem to the Temple Mount. And in the chapter that we did last week, in chapter 8, we saw that he bore witness to a series of four different idolatrous situations of different kinds, different worshipers, different idols, different settings, different types of worship, and this was meant to give us a sense of the range of idolatry. Was it all happening contemporaneous to that moment? Were these scenes, over decades or longer? That we can't get a feel for. But clearly there is, a widespread background of idolatry, and this is the cause. And God keeps saying to him, you ain't seen nothing. I have more to show you. And this is the basis for which God says God is going to carry out great punishment against the Israelites without mercy or compassion. We've, long discussed how difficult that feels. One of the essayists on 929 pointed out one of the commentaries that says something. Let's see if I can quickly find it. Hold on. Yes, in the end of chapter 8, when God says, I will act with fury, I'll show no pity or compassion, one of the commentaries, the Metzudat David, paraphrases God's words and says that God is saying, just as the children of Israel have behaved improperly, so will I behave improperly, for I will show them no pity. So, on the one hand, that doesn't make you feel any better, right? Like, we don't expect God to stoop. Like, God should be on God's best behavior, even if we aren't. On the other hand, it's a smaller hand, but on the other hand, there's a sense of God's acknowledgement that this is, it's like when you, this is a terrible example, but kind of you have a rough day and you decide to, self-medicate with ice cream, and you take out a tub of ice cream from the freezer at night. And you sort of say, I know I shouldn't be doing this. I know this is a terrible idea. I'm just gonna have one more spoonful. I know I should just put this away, right? The sense of acknowledgement of wrong, of inappropriate behavior, even as you do it. Now, again, how could we possibly attribute to God that kind of thing? Gets to ethical questions, anthropomorphic questions. But it's interesting that the Metzudat Zion phrases it, or with the Metzudat David phrases it this way, that God is almost recognizing the inappropriateness, so to speak, or the impropriety of God's, unrestrained response. So that's the background. And in chapter 9, we're going to continue to see Ezekiel's vision in the temple. We're going to begin something which we will get into much more in chapter 10, which is the phased departure of God's presence from the temple. Again, to the extent to which we understand, you can't see God, God doesn't have a body, but God's presence is described in the Tanach in various ways. That presence is going to gradually move out of the temple environment. We're going to see the first step of that in Ezekiel chapter 9 today. The sages expand on this idea in Midrashim to talk about 10 stations of God's departure, and this is part of a bigger meta structure that the sages have, in which they understand God's process of coming down to be involved in human life and human history happens in stages, and then God's departure happens in stages. So we're going to see a little bit of that, and we're going to see a kind of a moment which harkens back to a number of possible prior moments. I'm putting Arnie on call for a possible Exodus association in this chapter, chapter 9. And for those who have the JPS Tanachs, chapter 9 begins on the top of page 1169, 1169. It's not a long chapter, it's a fairly narrative chapter, and has some fascinating descriptions that we will get to dig into over the next little bit. So let me share the text. We'll just note, I'll point this out just as we're beginning, that chapter 8, verse 18, the last verse in the prior chapter, ends, V'kar'u v'oznai kol gadol v'lo eshma otam, right? The reaction to God's fury and anger and punishment of the people is that they will cry out with a great noise, and God will not listen. V'kar'u v'oznai kol gadol. And then chapter 9 begins, Vayikra v'oznai kol gadol lemol. And then God called out in my ears loudly, saying. The previous chapter ends with God saying to Ezekiel, the people are going to cry out in anguish from my punishment, and I will not heed them. And then Ezekiel narrates to us that then God sort of raises God's voice, so to speak, and speaks loudly to Ezekiel. So we have this juxtaposition, the people's unheeded cry and God raising God's voice with the same language. Let's see. Elaine, will you start us off? Chapter 9.
Then he called loudly in my hearing, saying, "Approach, you men in charge of the city, each bearing his weapons of destruction." And 6 men entered by way of the upper gate that faces north, each with his club in his hand. And among them was another, clothed in linen, with a writing case at his waist. They came forward and stopped at the bronze altar. Now the presence of the God of Israel had moved from the cherub on which it had rested to the platform of the house. He called to the man clothed in linen with the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, "Pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who moan and groan because of all the abominations that are committed in it." To the others he said in my hearing, "Follow him through the city and strike. Show no pity or compassion. Kill off graybeard, youth and maiden, women and children, but do not touch any person who bears the mark. Begin here at my sanctuary." So they began with the elders who were in front of the house. And he said to them, "Defile the house and fill the courts with the slain, then go forth." So they went forth and began to kill in the city. When they were out killing and I remained alone, I flung myself on my face and cried out, Lord God, are you going to annihilate all that is left of Israel, pouring out your fury upon Jerusalem?" He answered me, "The iniquity of the houses of Judah and Israel is very, very great. The land is full of crime, and the city is full of corruption. For they say, 'The Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see.' I, in turn, will show no pity or compassion. I will give them their deserts." And then the man clothed in linen with the writing case at his waist brought back word saying, "I have done as you commanded me."
Okay. So again, a pretty heavy chapter, and here it sounds as though a great massacre is being carried out amongst the people. Now, again, remember, this is a prophecy. This is a vision. This did not happen in real life in real time in this moment, but this is what Ezekiel is being shown. So it's very stark and I can imagine in some sense traumatic for him to watch and behold, and it's heavy. Let us go back to the beginning of the chapter. I want to, as we said, not a long chapter. I'll make a number of particular notes, and then we'll open it up for comments. Um, so God calls out again. Ezekiel is at the entrance to the temple, or he's actually now already. If we go back to the previous, he's in the inner court in the end of chapter 8. He's in the Chatzer HaPnimit, so he's really in the interior of the chapel, of the tabernacle or temple rather. There we go. Got it on the third time of the temple. He's in the inner chamber of the temple, and God calls out loudly, but is not actually talking to Ezekiel. God says, and Ezekiel can hear, Karavu pekudo ta'ir, approach you officers, people in charge of the city, and each of you should have, should gird yourself with your weapons, put on your weapons, and draw near. There's an irony there in the language of karavu, because of course the draw near is the language of korban, of offering or sacrifice. So Ezekiel is sitting there in the heart of the temple where sacrifices are offered. He hears God's voice calling out, and it's almost saying offer an offering, which would be the peaceful, appropriate thing to happen in that space. But instead, God is saying to people who are going to cause harm, put on your weapons and come. And this is in and of itself a defilement of the temple, as it begins in verse 2. The idea that people come with their weapons into the temple. The temple is always meant to be a place of peace. And in fact, the very altar is not allowed to be hewn. The stones of the altar are not allowed to be hewn with metal implements, because the Talmud says metal kills. Metal is an instrument of war, and the altar and the temple are supposed to be vehicles of peace. And so the idea of people even coming with weapons into the temple proper is itself already sort of a defilement of it. And each person comes in, they come from the north. Always, in the prophets, pretty much always punishment comes from the north. And we have these, warrior type folks, 6 of them. V'ish echad betocham lavush badim. And one amongst them, which doesn't seem to mean one of the 6, but mixed up in their midst was one man who was wearing linen. The keset hasofer b'motnav. And of course, the high priest also wears linen at various times. So we have kind of this contrast figure to the weapons is the scribe. And this is also a kind of a classic Jewish contrast, the writer, the scribe, as opposed to the warrior. So here we have a scribe. So maybe we have like a moment of respite or hope. Okay, the warriors are coming in, but also the scribe is coming in. But we're about to find out what the scribe's task is. And he has his writing case, Keset HaSofer, that happens to become used as the name for one of the major works on the laws of Jewish scribal arts of Safrut, is called Keset HaSofer, the kind of scribal or writer's case. He's got that at his waist, again, where like a sword might be in a hilt. Instead, it's the writing case. So we have this possibility of a more peaceful dimension. They come in and they stand by the bronze altar. And now we're told in verse 3 that the presence of God, na'ala, now normally going up sounds like a good thing, but here the going up is a going away. And so it's not a good thing. The presence of God has gone from the cherub upon which it rested out to the platform, which means sort of the gate of the house, right? We know already from the book of Shemot, when the tabernacle is described, that in the Holy of Holies there is an ark. On top of the ark is an ark cover with the 2 cherubs. And it says explicitly that when Moses wants to communicate with God, he's supposed to, go to that place. And God's voice is going to emanate from the space between the cherubs. So that's where Kavod Adonai, however we understand the glory of God, the presence of God, that is where it resides or manifests. That's where it hangs out when the temple is functioning normally. And now we're being told that it's departing. So this is again, it's in a vision, but it's a hugely important moment if the presence of God goes from the place where it normally dwells to meet and communicate, and now it's going up, it's going away, and it's distancing itself out to the entrance. The entrance is where the warriors have just come in. So the warriors come in, they are anathema to the temple, and you have the feeling if they're there, God can't be there. So God is distancing God's self. And even still, now God calls to the man clothed in linen. And we have, like, we could, again, we're still hoping, dreaming, maybe God's going to say, tell those warriors to get out of here. But no, God says, pass through the city, through Jerusalem. Vihitvita tav. Okay, put a mark. Now, the word tav means mark. We also hear in it the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, taf. We say taf, but it really is tav. Put a mark, a tav, on the foreheads of the men. Which ones? Hane'enachim v'hane'enakim al kol ha'toivot hanasot betucha. The people who are upset, who are groaning with anguish and despair over the idolatry. Find the people who are upset about the idolatry and put a mark on their forehead. That's going to be a protective mark. If you're upset about idolatry, you're on the good side. If you are an idolater or you don't mind that idolatry is happening, it doesn't bother you at all, you're on the bad side. Bear with me. And then God says to everybody else, right, to the 6 warriors, follow through the city and strike anyone we see in verse 6, regardless of age or background, old, young, men and women. Strike anybody, but anybody asher alav hatav al tigashu. But anyone who has the mark on them, don't draw near. Okay, so we've got a mark of protection on people who have protested idolatry, and everybody else does not have that mark, and everybody else who doesn't have the mark is going to be killed. They start with the elders who are in front of the house. God says, go, show no compassion, go forth. Vayatzu v'hiku va'ir. They go forth and they start killing in the city. We'll have to keep in mind that the term for the destroyer here has been mashchit. That's the kind of term for destruction. While they're out killing, Ezekiel is still hanging out in the center of the temple. He's alone, and he throws himself down on his face and he says, Aha, Adonai Elohim. Aha is a term for woe. We find that it appears only 15 times in the Tanach, and Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel each have it 4 times. So this is a term that kind of pops up in the prophets. Elaine had asked a number of weeks ago about Adonai Elohim, and I took a look at that too and saw that it appears 222 times in the book of Ezekiel. That's astonishing frequency. The next most frequent after that is in Tehillim, then Yeshayahu, Amos, and Yirmiyahu. So we see it's prominent in the prophets. It only appears 8 times in Breshit, 6 in Shemot, etc. So it's much more of a latter prophets term for God, and it's most of all, far and away by frequency, appears in Yechezkel. Now, so hold on a moment. That looks like it is the frequency of Adonai as opposed to Adonai Elohim, which is what I thought I searched for. So I have to go back and check the Adonai Elohims. For some reason, that search didn't go through the way I wanted to. So hold off on the frequency of Adonai Elohims. This seems to just be Adonai. So I have to come back to that search. So sorry, I'll get more information on that for next time. I thought I had that how I wanted it. Okay, so aha, a term of woe. We're back in verse 8. Adonai Elohim, Lord God, are you going to annihilate? Same term, hamashchit. Are you going to annihilate all that remains of Israel, pouring out your fury upon Jerusalem? Now, what we seem to understand from this question, why is Ezekiel there? This question could mean 2 things. When Ezekiel says, are you going to annihilate all that's left of Israel? So, first of all, the exiles are sort of what's left of Israel. We don't know at this point I'm sorry, let me start that again. We are here in Jerusalem, and so we're kind of dismissed the exiles. They're kind of gone. We're looking at the remnant of the people who are in Jerusalem. They are those who remain. So when Ezekiel says, are you going to annihilate all that's left of Israel? He could either mean, besides for the people who have the mark, who are protected, are you really going to carry out this selective destruction and annihilate everyone else? Or Ezekiel may mean, I see that no one has the mark on their forehead. I see that there's no one who's protected. Are you going to actually go ahead and wipe out everyone? We're left with this question. Did anyone actually get the mark on their forehead? We can't tell from the text here. Ezekiel could be saying, I get that you're protecting a few people, but are you still going to annihilate everybody else? Or he might be saying, I see that no one has the protection. Are you annihilating everyone? We can't tell from here. But either way, Ezekiel is upset about God's reaction here. And God answers and says in verse 9, the sin of Yehudah is gadol b'me'od me'od. It's very, very bad. The earth is filled with their blood and crime and corruption. They believe that God has forsaken the land and doesn't see them, and therefore that they can act with impunity. And that's not right. And therefore, very similar to the way chapter 8 ended, I in turn will have no compassion. I will give them what they deserve. And then the man clothed in linen comes back or sends back word. It seems like brought back word. He returns with his word, saying, Asiti kechol asher tzivitani. I have done as you have commanded me. Now, again, we don't know. Does that mean I found people and I put the mark on their forehead? Or does it mean I walked all throughout? I couldn't find anyone to put a mark, and now I'm finished. Of course, what stands out as the end of the chapter is just the contrast between the sense that God is presenting to us that no one does what God says. Everybody worships idols or does corruption or wrongdoing. We have this one guy who comes back and says, I did what you asked. I followed your command. Asiti kechol asher tzivitani. But what good is that, loyalty to God at this point? It's loyalty in essentially preparing for destruction. So it highlights how low a station we've come to, that that what it means to obey God's word is to, mark people essentially, yes, for protection, but by implication, to leave the masses for destruction. That's the only command of God left to fulfill, is carrying out the punishment for the extensive non-fulfillment of God's commands. So it's very, very heavy. I want to point out some textual parallels, but first I want to take comments and reactions. I will start with Estelle, Elaine, and Lance.
Well, what I thought was very interesting is that throughout history or generations, whatever, when a person had a mark on his forehead, it was a sign of negativism, of an outcast. And here, this reverses it, the whole bit. I find that just a little bit strange.
Okay, great. So Estelle, and we'll come back to this. Estelle comments, her associations with a mark is a mark of shame or a mark of, punishment. And here the mark is a mark of protection. So, why is that, right? I guess I would say this as an initial comment, and then I'll save the textual parallels for later. It might reflect nothing more than the fact that the minority usually is who does wrong and gets punished, right? You have to mark the people for shame because those are the exceptions to the rule. Everybody's doing fine, but you did something wrong. I got to put a sign on you. Here, the notion is it's so rampant, the wrongdoing, that the mark goes on only the people who didn't do the wrong. So it might not be sort of an intrinsic idea, does a mark represent shame or protection? It might simply be we mark the minority, and the minority was often, the wrongdoers were often the minority. Here, the wrongdoers are the majority. You're shaking your head. Why?
It doesn't fit. I mean, it's justification.
Okay. So for you, it's much more that marks symbolize wrongdoing, and so it's unusual to have it symbolize protection.
Yes, and the idea that there should be fewer people who did wrong than I mean, I know what we've read and I know everything, but I still can't believe that more people did wrong than right.
Yeah. Yes, fair. Okay, Elaine and then Lance, and then we'll see who else wants to comment.
Well, there's blood on the doorpost, and that protected Jewish people, so that was a mark. Also, I don't know, Ash Wednesday, I don't know why they have a mark on their forehead, or Hindus have marks on their forehead. It's very shocking because this is the remnant, as you said, and according to what we read in Jeremiah, they were the poorest people who were left behind.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, two very good points. So first of all, you are noting correctly that one association that we have with a mark of protection is the blood on the doorpost, right? And there, in a sense, we can draw a real parallel, and I know I'm just saying what Arnie's going to say. Hopefully, he'll expand, but we can draw a real parallel because that blood on the doorpost was in many ways about, and certainly the rabbis developed this much more. It's less explicit in the text, but the blood on the doorpost was the blood of the lamb, right? And we have some hints from the Torah, and it's unclear whether it's borne out by archaeological historical scholarship. We have some hints in the Torah that the lamb was worshipped in Egypt. So slaughtering the lamb, in a sense, is killing the gods of Egypt. And the gods of Egypt would have been the only alternative that the Israelites might have had about who they might have worshipped when they were in Egypt. They barely even knew the Israelite God. So slaughtering the god of Egypt and putting the blood on the doorpost is essentially saying, I reject Egyptian gods. I embrace the Israelite God. I reject idolatry and I support monotheism. And so there we could see, if we read it that way in Egypt, we see a great parallel here. The mark is the mark of rejecting idolatry, and that grants you protection. And I will also just note here, without opening up the text, but when God talks about the plague of the firstborn, God says a number of times that the force that's going to go through Egypt in that night is called the Mashchit, the destroyer. And when the people put the blood on their doorposts, God will not allow the destroyer, the Mashchit, to damage them. And that's the same term that we have here. It also takes us back to Noach. We've seen a lot of parallels to Noach with Vatishachet haaretz, the earth becoming corrupt. So we have these thematic connections, especially to the Exodus and the protective blood sign, so to speak. Hold on, we're going to come to Lance next, and then Ellen, and then Carl. Go ahead, Lance.
Okay, it seems to me that the God of Ezekiel 9 is the same God of Noah and the flood, the same God of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, also the same God of Nahum and Nineveh. And there is really a second God in Judaism, and that's the God of Moses, who has some compassion for the Egyptians. You remember Hallel? We skipped that paragraph because of the Egypt, I think. Am I correct, Rav Stephen?
What's that?
We skipped a paragraph in Hallel about the Egyptians in sympathy with the Egyptians who were killed in the Red Sea. No? Anyway.
I'm not familiar with that, but okay.
Okay. Anyway, that's that. The most important thing for me, I am a legal fiction. I am a Cohen, right? Priest. Mm-hmm. Now think about if the man in linen is a priest and Ezekiel is a priest.
Yes.
Think about the character that they represent. The character of the man in linen is a flunky, a stooge of God. The Ezekiel is somebody who has absolutely no power. He just sits there and cries out. And think of the other prophets. Think about Abraham and the other prophets. They all say to God, please do this. If my people will only obey, we'll do this. Moses manages to save the people after the golden calf, right? Mm-hmm. So there is here something that is, for me, very disturbing. And I might add, finally, perhaps, that this idea of killing children is what the Nazis did, 1.5 million children. Yeah. And think about Hamas. Think about what Hamas did to our children. Beheading, burning, outrageous, absolutely outrageous. And Rabbi Shmuley Boteach wrote an article saying, where was God on October 7th? Where is God? not the God of providence, certainly. So I'm outraged, but nothing I can do about it. I'm powerless.
I feel you. I feel you.
They don't
I feel
listen.
you. Ellen, go ahead.
The difference between the marking of the doorpost
Yeah.
and this is that the Israelites did their own marking,
Mm-hmm.
but here there's a judge doing the marking. They self-identified.
Yes.
And so it was an action, and it was more than just a belief. It was an action.
Yes.
It was taking a public action to say, I do not believe in idolatry.
Yes.
Here, they had no say in it.
Mm-hmm.
This is just totally a judgment of someone or God
Yeah.
else. And I'm not quite sure I'm what that significance is, yet it stands out for me because we have no say, sort of, then in what happens to us.
Right. 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 It's interesting. It's a very interesting distinction. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, how might the parallel have played out if God had sent a messenger through, you know, throughout the camp? Again, this is all in a vision. This is a vision, but in that vision, if God had sent a messenger throughout the, you know, Judah and Jerusalem to say, if you disavow idolatry, put this mark on your doorpost and you will be saved, and if not, the destroyer will come through and kill you. You know, then I think all of a sudden everybody would have disavowed idolatry. Now it makes you think back to the Exodus, you know, what was at stake for people. But yeah, it's very interesting. It's an interesting distinction. It bears more thought. I love that you raised it. I'm not going to say more on it now. I'm going to go to Carl and then Arnie.
Okay, so this, I mean, clearly there's a lot of discomfort with what we're hearing and what you're reading. And I would just put a little different outlook, spin on that, or in context that I find also disturbing. In Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, and certainly in the other prophets, the minor prophets, there's a lot of stress on the injustice to the poor, about, you know, social issues that are being violated. And now you might say, well, Yechezkel, he basically lived in the temple. He was a priest and probably was in the temple while he was in Israel, and so he's just concentrating on the temple. But that's just also disturbing because, you know, the whole country is going to be destroyed. And in all the prophets, there seems to be at least in Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, a concentration on Yerushalayim, not on the rest of the country.
Right.
But as we know from what subsequently happened, it was not just Jerusalem that was destroyed.
Right.
There was destruction throughout Israel. And so the people who weren't in Jerusalem, and if you didn't live in Jerusalem, what was going on in the temple was not a major concern of yours.
Yeah. Yes.
Bamot had been eliminated to a large extent by Yoshia. And so then you can say, well, the whole country should have suffered because they were all doing, you know, violating ritual laws and sacrifices to who knows whom.
Right.
But here, I don't know if it was over, but there's no emphasis on what the other people were doing.
Right.
And I have to go back to the text you read when he said that he'd go around the people, at least the English was that, you know, who were upset at the crimes.
Yes.
I don't know if that was, again, from the Hebrews seemed to be more upset at what was going on in the temple, the crimes about idolatry. Whereas if it was crimes against the poor, then you would have said, aha, maybe they're going to be saved because they're the victims. It's not clear they're the victims of what was actually happening in the temple.
Right.
And just another point, Yechezkel was only several years removed from the temple, and he has this vision of all these terrible things happening. So did that all happen in just the last few years? So there's a lot of troubling things in these
Yeah.
chapters, as everybody acknowledges.
Yes. 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 Really interesting points. And I think that question of kind of how, as you said, Jerusalem centric, temple centric, is the Tanakh, is God, so to speak, in these ways? And is there a disproportionate focus there, which is kind of unfair to the people out and, to borrow from a modern term in the periphery, um, who maybe whether their wrongdoing is less extreme, um, but they're being all painted with the same brush, right? Certainly the fact that the previous chapter really was all about idolatry in Jerusalem and in the temple. Why don't we have examples? Why shouldn't we see examples of other idolatry in other places to justify the punishment in the other places? So I think these are very good points. Yep. Thank you. Arnie?
I have just a couple of short random thoughts. First of all, God puts a mark on Cain
Good.
to protect him.
So
Yep.
that's negative.
No, hold on. That's a protective mark. Arnie's correct. God puts so we'll look at that afterwards. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yes, good, thank you.
And second of all, the focus on Jerusalem, there were the 3 holidays where people would come to Jerusalem. The entire country, more or less, would come. So Jerusalem was in everybody's life, I think. I don't know if Josephus is to be believed, and he came much later, but he talked about the millions of sacrifices that were offered during Pesach.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those millions were brought by families and people, and so it's probably exaggerated, but Josephus, I guess, meant to say a lot. A
Yeah.
lot of people came to Jerusalem, and
Yeah.
that was, God rested between the cherubs. So
Right.
Jerusalem was different than any place else, and it was the focal point.
Yeah.
I also personally feel that I like the fact that even if it was sort of meekly worded, Ezekiel did protest to God here a little bit,
Yes.
and I'm glad he stood up.
Yes. Or fell down, as the case may be.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And lastly, and maybe this is a bigger thing, um, Son of Man does not appear in this chapter
Mm,
because Ezekiel is not being addressed directly.
right.
He's an observer of what's happening. But I read that Son of Man uh, appears almost 100 times in Ezekiel.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that Ezekiel is the only prophet who's referred to only as Son of Man.
Right.
Other prophets are called like Son of Man, Elijah. The name is applied after Son of Man. So it's a more personal thing when God is using that term to a prophet.
Yeah.
So I think, from what I've read so far of the book, and I kind of read several chapters afterwards, Ezekiel somehow seems to me to be, several of the prophets are unique, but certainly Ezekiel is unique in his prophecies of destruction and redemption in the graphic nature of how he presents them.
Yes.
Uh,
Absolutely.
so I think that there is a distinction between O mortal and I'm God who knows what I'm doing. And you know, you don't.
Yes. 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 It's a nice description of the dynamics between them. Ezekiel's willingness to stand up, and yet God's addressing him in a way that highlights the difference between them. We'll come to Lance in a few moments. I want to just circle back to what Arnie pointed out about Cain, the mark of Cain, because it's a very interesting text. In Genesis chapter 4, we read, as my computer loads it up,
Comparing that.
we read after Cain kills Abel, after Cain kills Havel, and God, punishes him, where is Abel? Am I my brother's keeper? What have you done? His bloods cry out to me from the earth. And Cain gets the punishment, being more cursed than the earth, and it will no longer, naturally yield its produce. And Cain says, my sin is too great, or my punishment, my sin, it's a little unclear, is too great to bear. You've, banished me or distanced me from the soil, and now I'm going to have to wander, and anyone who meets me may kill me. And God says, Lachein kol horeg Cain shivatayim yukam. Anyone who kills Cain will be avenged sevenfold. Vayasem Adonai leCain ot. And God made for or placed upon, it's not clear, Cain an ot, a sign. The word ot in Hebrew also means letter. So there's a little play between a sign or a symbol and literally an alphabetical letter, an ot. Levilti hakot oto kol motzao, so that anyone who meet him will not kill him. Okay, this is the exact same term, hakot, which is what the 6 armed men are being told to go out through Jerusalem and do, is lehakot, except for those who have the mark, which is called the tav in our text in Yechezkel. So very, very similar sort of sense. What's a little bit less explicit in Bereshit, in our story with Cain and Hevel, is where is the mark? What is the mark? All the text says is God placed for or upon Cain a mark, a symbol, a sign. Could be all kinds of things. Rashi comments there, Chakak lo ot mishmo b'mitzcho. God engraved or, wrote a letter of God's name on Cain's forehead. I think it's impossible not to imagine, just as a textual comment here, that the reason Rashi explains this way is influenced from Yechezkel. Meaning, even though the story in Bereshit is long before the story in Yechezkel, Rashi's interpretation of the story comes long after Yechezkel. And Rashi's thinking, a sign or a mark being placed on someone so that people won't kill them. Do we have that anywhere else in Tanach? Yes, we have it in the story of Ezekiel 9. What is the mark in Ezekiel 9? It is Tav al Mitzchot, a mark, which is literally a letter of the alphabet, which is placed on people's foreheads. And Rashi, influenced by that, suggests that this must be, a letter or a sign being placed on Cain's forehead. We truly have no idea from the biblical text what it is. The idea that it's a letter from God's name is fascinating. If indeed in Ezekiel, the tav, the mark, is actually the letter taf, the last letter of the alphabet, that is not a letter of God's name. So we're not talking about identical things, but it seems to me, almost for sure that Rashi was influenced by the Ezekiel text in the way he interprets our story in Bereshit. Now, what actually was the mark? We'll take a little flight of fancy to the Talmud. The Gemara in Shabbat 55a discusses our passage for a variety of reasons that we're not going to go into now. Maybe we'll come back to it, maybe not, but I encourage you to check out Shabbat 55a for the whole story. When the Gemara is discussing it for a different reason, comes back to the details of the case and asks, Maishna Tav, Why specifically tav? Now, again, tav literally means mark or sign, but the Gemara is assuming that it literally means the letter taf. Why the letter tav on the foreheads of these people who protested the idolatry or groaned over the idolatry and therefore should be protected? The Gemara says, Amarav tav tichyeh, tav tamut. Tav is the first letter in the word tichyeh, you shall live. And also the first letter in the word tamut, you shall die. Now it seems like the Gemara might think that there were different marks put on different people's foreheads to differentiate the living from the dead, which is not what the pasuk seems to indicate. But that seems to be the way the Gemara is thinking. And then it gives another interpretation. And then we have Reish Lakish, who says the following: Tav, Sof Chotamo Shel Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Tav, Taf, is the last letter of the seal of God. What does it mean, the seal of God? Damar Rabbi Chanina, as Rabbi Chanina says, Chotamo Shel Hakadosh Baruch Hu Emet. The seal, the sign, the stamp of God is truth. Truth. Aleph Emet. Aleph Mem Taf. So Taf is like the signature, the very end of the word truth, which is the stamp, the essence of God. And of course, God is truth, and idolatry is the ultimate falsehood. So the tav is the sort of shorthand for the word truth, which is God as opposed to idolatry. This then, by the way, tightens the connection between Rashi's interpretation back in Genesis and here by allowing us to imagine that while God's name is not Emet, maybe Rashi was even imagining that Cain had put on his forehead the taf that is the end of the word Emet. Hard to say for sure because it's not exactly a letter of God's name, but it is one of the letters of the word truth, which is God's stamp or seal. And then the Gemara, just last little note here. Again, there's much more, but the Gemara here in Shabbat 55a also suggests the possibility that Tav is Elu b'nei Adam shekiyamu et Torah kula me aleph ad taf. Maybe these are the people who kept the Torah from A to Z, so to speak. Aleph ad taf, taf being sort of the end, the culmination of keeping the Torah, and that's what the sign on the forehead of these people might be. So we have Stell is just, if you could see her shaking her head in exasperation, you can imagine it. So fascinating, lots to kind of imagine and explore from the perspective of what this mark might be. But we have two very important biblical precursors, in which we've also already pointed out the distinctions. We have the Exodus, but there it's, as Ellen said so beautifully, self-identifying, self-selecting, as opposed to being judged by others. And then we have the sign being placed on Cain, which is a mark of protection. The difference between the two stories is that we don't know at all exactly what the mark is or where it was placed in the story of Cain. What I think is a powerful potential parallel from the stories is Cain is protected, but he's a sinner. Cain's a murderer. But God says, okay, you got your punishment, and I'm not going to cause you to be punished anymore. But Cain's not a good guy in the story. So, the people who are groaning and moaning over the idolatry, if we want to draw a tighter parallel to the Genesis story, maybe the subtle hint here is even these guys aren't great. They're not pious, reverent servants of God. They're just people who are standing at home saying, listen, idolatry, I mean, that's not so good. We really, it's a bummer that people are worshiping idols, but are exemplars of righteous behavior? Not necessarily. So again, we don't have to make that comparison, but if we want to strike a parallel between Cain and these people, then those who are being protected are not necessarily the best. They're just not the worst. And they've done enough to warrant protection. The Gemara actually goes in another direction and says, did everybody really deserve to be punished? And says, well, if you don't protest idolatry, you're complicit in idolatry. So actually, yeah, there were lots of people who got killed who weren't idolaters, but they didn't stand up against the idolatry. Now, does it make it better? On the one hand, we're saying, yeah, they weren't all such bad sinners. On the other hand, we're killing them all. So it's a pretty harsh punishment, but it's the kind of backdrop for the Talmud's comment, which Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel quoted in many places in the frame of few are guilty, but all are responsible, which is, based on this Gemara's notion of if you don't protest, then you are guilty by implication. So I think Lance had a comment he wanted to make still. And
to paraphrase Perry Mason, no further comments, Ralph Steven.
Okay, very good, very good. Anyone else want to share any thoughts or reactions before we wrap up?
It doesn't, you're rationalizing this was done for this reason, this was done for that reason. I mean, I can't believe this.
Yeah, it's interpretation. We have the humility to know that we have no idea for sure, but these are our sacred texts, so we explore and offer possibilities.
I'm sorry. I really cannot accept this.
For this, you came back from Israel, Anyway, yep, Ellen, go ahead.
I would almost take the Cain and Abel story as evidence against capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
God reserves for himself.
But he was a her.
And God reserves the ultimate execution of someone for himself.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening in Ezekiel, and that's what happened there.
Yeah.
He can punish, but no one else can take that life unless he says so.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a fan of that interpretation. You can always find texts and interpretations in either direction, but I happen to like that one. So yeah. Arnie, last words.
So I just think it's interesting how the people evolved and God evolved from the Cain story to the Ezekiel story. So Cain killed 25% of the people in the world, and God didn't kill him. He punished him and protected him. In a sense, Cain's cry of anguish about his punishment was some form of tshuva that reached God's ears. Yet, fast forward to Ezekiel, and God says, "Nope, I don't care. These people are so bad. They're not going to get another chance. I'm not going to hear any pleas. It's done."
Yeah.
Or it says something about the crime of murder, as horrible as it is not in God's eyes as horrid as the crime of idolatry.
Oh, boy.
That idolatry is, for whatever reason, the worst.
Right. Or in that moment.
You can change their mind,
Yeah.
but you can't arise from being.
I'm simply interpreting that.
I know. Wrong.
Okay, we've got some rousing discussion here, which we will continue afterwards. Next Thursday, we should be in our regular place and time for our final class. I will try to remember to bring snacks for those who come in person, and we'll look forward to chapter 10 next week. And love to mom and dad. A great day to all. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hello.
Bye-bye.